The water came through the damaged pressure hull in a needle-thin stream that struck the back of my neck like an ice pick, and in that moment I understood that I was going to die in the dark, surrounded by men who believed I was already dead. I had been unconscious for perhaps 3 minutes, maybe 5, wedged behind the torpedo loading mechanism in the forward compartment, when the depth charge hit, and when I came to, the lights were out. The emergency klaxon was screaming somewhere in the distance, and the crew was already sealing the bulkhead door. I heard Captain Lieutenant Richter's voice, clipped and mechanical in the chaos, ordering the compartment abandoned, and then the wheel spun with its terrible finality, and I was alone with 2 tons of unexploded ordnance, and the realization that no one had seen me, crumpled in the shadows between the steel tubes. The cold Atlantic water was already ankle-deep when I managed to pull myself upright, my head throbbing where it had connected with the bulkhead during the explosion. My ears rang with a high, persistent whine that made every other sound seem muffled and distant, as though I were listening to the world through layers of wool. The boat was listing at 12 degrees to starboard. I could feel it in my legs, in the way gravity pulled me sideways, and descending. We were going down. The needle spray from the hull breach was joined by a second, then a third, each one adding its voice to the growing chorus of destruction. In the absolute darkness I could not see them, but I could hear them, feel them, a fine mist that filled the compartment with the smell of salt and iron and the cold certainty of drowning. I had been aboard U-517 for 23 days, transferred from U-126 after our boat took damage off the Azores and limped back to Lorient for repairs. The Kriegsmarine did not waste sailors on shore leave when submarines needed crew, and so I found myself assigned to Richter's command, a Type 1C boat with a reputation for aggression and a skipper who believed that audacity was the highest form of tactics. We had been hunting convoy routes south of Iceland when the destroyers found us, 2 of them working in coordinated sweeps, their sonar pinging through the water like mechanical heartbeats. Richter had taken us deep, 180 meters, past the recommended crush depth, and held us there in silence while the first pattern of depth charges walked across our position. The explosions had been distant thunder, almost gentle, until the third pattern came directly overhead, and the world turned into noise and violence. I remembered the lights shattering, remembered the deck jumping beneath my feet, remembered being thrown backward into the torpedo rack with enough force to crack my skull against solid steel. Then nothing. And now this, sealed in the forward compartment with the ocean pressing in through a dozen hairline fractures in the pressure hull, the boat sinking beneath me while the crew fought for survival on the other side of that locked door. The emergency torch was mounted on the forward bulkhead, and I splashed through the rising water to find it, my hands moving over cold metal in the darkness until my fingers closed around the rubber grip. The battery was weak. These things were always weak after weeks at sea, but when I thumbed the switch, a feeble yellow cone of light pushed back the absolute black. The compartment looked like something from a nightmare. The deck was tilted at an angle that made walking difficult, and water sloshed around my shins, already cold enough to make my legs ache. The torpedoes in their racks gleamed dully in the torchlight, 4 fish loaded and ready, each one a 1.5-ton weapon that could crack a freighter in half. They looked obscene in that confined space, too large, too deadly, too indifferent to the fact that the boat carrying them was dying. I moved to the bulkhead door and pressed my ear against the cold steel. On the other side, I could hear voices, muffled and indistinct, orders being shouted over the groaning protest of the hull. I hammered on the door with my fist, 3 times, then 3 times again, the international signal for distress. The sound was flat and dull, absorbed by the water and the ambient noise of a submarine in crisis. I waited, counted to 10, hammered again. Nothing. Either they could not hear me over the chaos, or they thought the sounds were just another manifestation of the boat's death throes, metal stress, shifting equipment, the 1,000 random noises of a vessel being crushed by the Atlantic. I tried the wheel mechanism, knowing even as I did so that it was futile. The door was dogged from the other side, multiple locks engaged to keep the compartment sealed and prevent flooding from spreading through the boat. It was standard procedure, drilled into every submariner from their first day of training. Damage control meant isolation, containment, sacrifice. One compartment, one section, one man. These were acceptable losses if they bought time for the rest of the crew to survive. I was that acceptable loss now, and the wheel would not budge, no matter how hard I threw my weight against it. The water was at my knees now, rising faster as the pressure differential increased. I swept the torchlight around the compartment, looking for options, for anything that might serve as salvation. The escape trunk was aft, in the next compartment, useless to me now. The torpedo tubes themselves were sealed, the outer doors closed, the tubes empty of water in preparation for the next attack that would never come. Even if I could open the breech doors, even if I could somehow crawl into one of the tubes, I would be trapped in a steel coffin barely wider than my shoulders, with no way to equalize pressure or open the outer door. It would be a slower death, but just as certain. The cold was starting to work its way into my core, that deep bone ache that comes from immersion in water barely above freezing. My teeth began to chatter, an involuntary response that I could not control, and I recognized the early stages of hypothermia. The body shuts down in increments, systems failing in a cascading sequence that ends in unconsciousness and death. I had perhaps 20 minutes before the cold robbed me of the ability to think clearly, perhaps 40 before I lost consciousness entirely. The water would be over my head long before that. I forced myself to breathe slowly, to think with the disciplined calm that had been hammered into me during training. Panic was the enemy. Panic made you stupid, made you waste energy and oxygen on futile efforts. I needed to assess the situation with cold logic, needed to understand exactly what resources I had and what possibilities existed. The torch battery would last perhaps another hour. I had my service knife, my leather jacket, my wool cap. The compartment contained the torpedoes, the loading equipment, a small toolkit bolted to the bulkhead, various chains and cables for handling the weapons. There was a vent line running along the ceiling, part of the air circulation system, but it was no more than 10 centimeters in diameter, far too small to crawl through even if I could somehow remove the grating. The boat lurched suddenly, dropping another few degrees nose down, and I had to grab one of the torpedo racks to keep from falling. Something in the aft section gave way with a sound like a gunshot, a shriek of tearing metal that echoed through the hull. We were past 200 meters now, I was certain of it, descending into depths where the water pressure exceeded the design tolerances of the boat. The hull groaned under the load, a deep resonant sound that I could feel in my chest, and the streams of water coming through the breaches intensified, no longer needles but solid jets that carved through the darkness like liquid knives. I played the torchlight across the ceiling, following the path of the vent line, and that was when I noticed something I had missed before. Just forward of the torpedo loading mechanism, barely visible in the shadows, was a small access hatch set into the deck, no more than half a metre square, secured with 4 butterfly bolts. I had seen hatches like this before, though I had never paid them much attention. They led to the bilge spaces, the dark utilitarian voids beneath the main deck, where the boat's drainage systems and some of the electrical cabling ran. On most submarines they were claustrophobic crawl spaces barely large enough for a man to squeeze through, but they ran the length of the boat, connecting the compartments through passages too narrow for the main bulkhead doors. It was a desperate idea, probably suicidal, but it was the only idea I had. If I could get into the bilge, if I could navigate through the darkness and the water and the tangle of pipes and cables, I might be able to emerge in another compartment, one that was not sealed, one where the crew could see me and understand that I was alive. The water was at my thighs now, rising faster as the boat settled deeper. I had minutes to decide, and in those minutes the cold was sapping my strength and my will. I splashed to the hatch and dropped to my knees in the frigid water, feeling for the butterfly bolts. They were stiff with corrosion and salt, and my fingers were already going numb, but I got the first one loose, then the second. The third refused to budge, and I had to draw my knife and use the pommel as a hammer, striking the bolt until it finally yielded. The fourth came easier, and then the hatch was free. I lifted it, and the smell that rose from below was overwhelming. Bilge water, diesel oil, human waste, the accumulated rot of months at sea with inadequate ventilation. The water in the bilge was already sloshing with the motion of the sinking boat, dark and oily in the torchlight. I lowered myself through the hatch, feet first, holding the torch between my teeth, feeling my boots find purchase on submerged cables and pipework. The space was exactly as claustrophobic as I had feared, barely enough room to move, with the deckhead pressing down on my shoulders and the water already past my waist. I could see perhaps 3 meters ahead before the torchlight was swallowed by darkness and the twisted maze of the boat's mechanical guts. There was no clear path, no obvious direction, just a confusion of steel and shadow that extended into the black unknown. The hatch dropped shut above me with a hollow clang, and I was alone in a new kind of hell. The water was colder down here, thick with oil that made everything slippery and treacherous. I could feel things brushing against my legs in the darkness. Cables, chains, perhaps rats, though I tried not to think about that possibility. The rats on U-boats were legendary, bloated creatures that thrived in the filth and learned to avoid the traps and poison. They would be down here in the bilge, hundreds of them, and they would be looking for any avenue of escape just as I was. I began to crawl aft, using my hands and knees to navigate over and around the obstacles, the torch clenched in my teeth, casting its weak light on a surreal landscape of industrial nightmare. The hull groaned around me. The sounds amplified in this confined space until they seemed to come from everywhere at once. I could feel the boat settling deeper, the angle of descent increasing, and I knew that at some point the pressure would exceed the hull's capacity and the ocean would come pouring in through a catastrophic breach. When that happened, I would be drowned like a rat in a trap, crushed and suffocated in the darkness while the boat fell toward the bottom. The first bulkhead stopped me after perhaps 10 meters of crawling. The bilge passage narrowed to a gap no wider than my shoulders, a rectangular opening between 2 steel plates through which I could see more darkness on the other side. I tried to push through head first, but my jacket caught on something, and I was stuck, wedged in the gap with the water rising around my chest. Panic flared hot and immediate, the fear of being trapped, unable to move forward or back, held in place while the water rose over my face. But I forced it down, made myself breathe, made myself think. I shrugged out of the jacket, letting it drift away into the bilge, and tried again. This time I squeezed through, scraping my shoulders raw against the rough metal, and came out on the other side with my heart hammering and my breath coming in gasps. The next section of bilge was partially flooded, the water up to my shoulders, and I had to swim as much as crawl, pushing myself along by grabbing pipes and cable runs. The torch was dying now, the battery drained by the cold and the moisture, and the light was little more than a dim orange glow. I could barely see a meter ahead, could barely distinguish shapes from shadows, and I was navigating more by feel than by sight. My hands found obstacles, found gaps, found the path forward through pure instinct and desperation. I heard voices again, somewhere above and to my left, muffled by steel and water, but unmistakably human. The crew was close. I had to be near the command compartment now, or perhaps the engine room. I hammered on the overhead deck plates with my fist, 3 beats in rapid succession, a sound that I prayed would carry through the hull. The voices stopped, then resumed, and I could not tell if they had heard me, or if the sound had been lost in the ambient chaos of the dying boat. I hammered again, then again, until my hand was numb and throbbing. The boat shuddered violently and dropped, and I knew without being told that we had passed 250 meters that the hull was beginning to fail in earnest. The pressure at this depth was enormous, more than 350 pounds per square inch pressing in from all sides, looking for any weakness, any flaw in the welding or the rivets. The streams of water that had been thin jets were now solid columns, and in the bilge they were combining into a flood that was rising with terrifying speed. I was swimming now, using the overhead pipes to pull myself forward, the torch useless and abandoned behind me in the darkness. My hands found another bulkhead, another gap, and I forced myself through without pausing to assess whether it was possible. Something tore. My shirt, my skin. I could not tell. And then I was through, emerging into a section of bilge that was somehow drier, the water only chest deep. There was light ahead, faint and grey, filtering down through gaps in the deck plates. I could see the silhouettes of machinery above me, could hear the diesel engines still running, still trying to drive the propeller shafts even as the boat sank beneath them. I found a vertical access trunk, a narrow shaft with ladder rungs welded to the side, and I climbed. My hands were so cold I could barely feel the metal, and twice I nearly lost my grip and fell back into the water. But I kept climbing, pulling myself up metre by metre, until my head touched the hatch at the top. I could hear voices clearly now, very close, and I hammered on the hatch with both fists, screaming at the top of my lungs, though my voice was hoarse and ragged. The hatch opened without warning, and I nearly fell, catching myself on the ladder as light flooded down into the shaft. Electric light, impossibly bright after the darkness of the bilge. Hands grabbed my arms, my shoulders, hauling me up through the opening, and I found myself sprawled on the deck of the engine room, with a half-dozen men staring down at me in shock and disbelief. One of them was Oberleutnant Klein, the engineering officer, and his face was white as chalk. "How?" he began, but there was no time for explanations. The boat lurched again, harder this time, and somewhere forward there was an enormous crash as a bulkhead gave way. The lights flickered and steadied, and I could see the depth gauge on the bulkhead, 280 metres, and still descending. We were in the final moments now, minutes or perhaps only seconds from total hull collapse. Richter's voice came over the intercom, steady and calm despite the circumstances. "All hands prepare to surface. Blow all ballast tanks. Emergency ascent on my mark." There was a pause, and in that pause I could hear the hull groaning under the pressure, could feel the boat trembling like a living thing in pain. "Mark!" The engineers threw the levers, and the high-pressure air roared into the ballast tanks, forcing out thousands of litres of seawater in a desperate attempt to gain buoyancy. The boat shuddered, hesitated, and then, slowly, impossibly slowly, began to rise. The angle of the deck changed as the bow lifted, and I grabbed a pipe stanchion to keep from sliding aft. The pressure gauges began to unwind. 270 metres, 260, 250. We were ascending but far too slowly, and I knew that Richter was making a gamble. Either we would reach the surface and have a chance to abandon ship in some semblance of order, or the hull would fail during the ascent, and we would be crushed like an egg in a fist. The destroyers would be waiting up there, circling our last known position, ready to finish us with gunfire the moment we broached. Surfacing was suicide, but it was a quicker death than drowning in the dark, and it gave the crew a chance, however slim, of survival. Some men might make it into the water, might be picked up by the British. It was better than the alternative. 220 metres, 200 metres. The boat was rising faster now as the buoyancy took effect, but it was also taking on more water through the damaged sections, a race between ascent and flooding that would be decided in the next few minutes. I could hear the crew moving through the boat, preparing for surface action, closing watertight doors, gathering survival gear. Klein pulled me to my feet and thrust a life vest into my arms, and I struggled into it with numb fingers, while the deck continued to rise beneath me. 150 metres. The hull was groaning constantly now, a tortured sound that spoke of metal at the edge of failure. Something gave way in the forward compartments with a bang like a cannon shot, and the boat heeled over sharply to port before steadying. We had lost structural integrity somewhere, lost the ability to maintain trim, and we were rising in an uncontrolled ascent, that would bring us to the surface like a cork from a bottle, 100 meters. I could see the crew now, moving with practiced efficiency despite their fear, despite the knowledge that they were surfacing into the teeth of an enemy that would show no mercy. These were men who had lived together in intimate proximity for months, who had shared the same foul air and rancid food and constant danger, and now they were preparing to die together with a calm professionalism that bordered on the surreal. 50 meters. The light from above was visible now through the periscope well, a pale green luminescence that grew brighter as we rose. Richter's voice came over the intercom one last time. "Stand by for surface. All hands to abandon ship stations. Good luck." The intercom clicked off, and then there was only the sound of the boat rising, and the crew breathing, and the ocean pressing in through a dozen wounds. We broke the surface with a violence that threw men off their feet, the boat lurching up through the waves and crashing back down in an explosion of spray and foam. The hatch was opened immediately, and cold air rushed in, clean and salt-laden and impossibly sweet, after weeks of breathing the recycled foulness of the boat's atmosphere. Men began to pour up through the conning tower, and I joined them, climbing the ladder with legs that barely functioned, emerging onto the bridge to find a grey dawn and a calm sea and 2 destroyers bearing down on us with their guns already firing. The first shells went overhead with a sound like tearing canvas, and then the guns found their range and began to walk their fire across the water toward us. Richter was ordering the crew into the water, and men were jumping from the deck, some with life vests and some without, all of them swimming hard to get clear of the boat before it went down. I looked back once and saw the U-517 settling by the bow, water pouring through the forward hatches, the grey paint weathered and streaked with rust and oil, and then I jumped. The cold hit like a physical blow, driving the air from my lungs, and for a moment I was blind and deaf and completely disoriented. Then my life vest brought me back to the surface, and I was floating in the swell, gasping and choking on salt water, while around me the crew struggled in the waves. The destroyers had ceased fire now that we were in the water, and they were coming about to pick up survivors, their hulls looming enormous against the grey sky. I watched the U-517 as it sank, watched it slide beneath the waves bow first in a welter of bubbles and debris, and I thought about the forward compartment where I had been sealed and left for dead, about the darkness and the rising water, and the certainty that I would die there alone. The boat disappeared completely, leaving only a slick of oil and floating wreckage, and then a British launch was beside me, and hands were pulling me from the water, wrapping me in blankets, checking me for injuries, while I shivered uncontrollably and tried to speak but could not form the words. They took us aboard the destroyer and led us below to the mess deck, where we were given hot tea and soup and dry clothing, and gradually the crew reassembled. Richter, Klein, the torpedo officer, the radio man, 41 men in total. Not everyone had made it into the water. Some had gone down with the boat, trapped in compartments that flooded too quickly to escape, and I thought about how easily I could have been one of them, sealed in the forward torpedo room, counted among the lost when the final tally was made. Later, after we had been processed and confined to a holding area, Richter came to find me. He looked older on the surface, diminished somehow without his boat and his command, just another captured officer in borrowed clothes. He asked me how I had survived, how I had escaped from the sealed compartment, and I told him about the bilge, about crawling through the darkness and the water, about the desperate swim through spaces barely large enough for a man. He listened without speaking, and when I was finished, he was quiet for a long time. "I thought you were dead," he said finally. "I saw you go down when the depth charge hit, saw you wedged behind the torpedo rack, and there was no time to check, no time to be certain. We were taking water, and the boat was going down, and I made the decision to seal the compartment." He looked at me with eyes that held something that might have been guilt, or might have been relief, or might have been some combination of both. "I left you to die." I did not know what to say to that, so I said nothing. We both understood the mathematics of submarine warfare, the cold calculus that said one life was an acceptable price for 40. If I had been dead, as he believed, his decision would have been correct. If I had been conscious and able to signal, perhaps he would have made a different choice. But in the chaos and the darkness and the fear, with seconds to make a decision that would determine who lived and who died, he had done what his training demanded. The war would go on without us, without U-517, and other submarines would take our place in the Atlantic, hunting convoys until they too were hunted in turn. The cycle would continue, attack and counterattack, depth charge and torpedo, sinking and drowning, until one side or the other found a way to break the pattern, or until simple exhaustion made further conflict impossible. We were out of it now, Richter and his crew and I, bound for a prison camp in Canada or England, where we would sit out the remainder of the war behind wire. But I would remember the darkness in that forward compartment, would remember the sound of the wheels spinning shut, and the realization that I was alone with the rising water and the certainty of death. I would remember the cold and the fear and the desperate crawl through the bilge spaces, and I would remember the moment when the hatch opened and light flooded down, and I knew that I had somehow survived what should have been unsurvivable. The British sailors treated us correctly, following the protocols of the Geneva Convention, and by late afternoon we were being transferred to a larger vessel for transport to the detention facility. I stood on the deck in the fading light and looked out at the grey Atlantic, at the endless rolling swells that hid so many secrets and so many dead, and I thought about how close I had come to being one more casualty in a war that would eventually claim millions. The water was indifferent to all of it, to the submarines and the destroyers, to the men who fought and the men who drowned, to the whole vast machinery of industrial death that was still grinding away somewhere over the horizon. The sun was setting when they took us below, painting the clouds in shades of orange and red, and in that final moment before the hatch closed, I saw a seabird circling in the distance, impossibly far from land, riding the wind with effortless grace. It was alone out there above the waves, just as I had been alone in the darkness of the sinking boat, and I wondered if it knew how fragile its survival was, how quickly the ocean could reach up and claim it if the wind failed or exhaustion set in. Then the hatch closed, and we descended into the warmth and light of the ship's interior, and the moment was gone, just another memory to join the thousands of others that would haunt the nights to come.